you can count when you're happy. 1, 2, 3, 4, you can count when you're sad. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or count when you're frightened. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, count when you're mad. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Counting is wonderful. Counting is marvelous. Counting's terrific and how.
With only one pointless Clark tease in between, we are hip deep back into Luthor family drama, building on the developments in Lex and Lionel's power struggle in Suspect, where Lionel played some dirty pool that led to his taking over Lex's company. Dirty pool is fitting because if he'd still been blind and got beamed by the ball Lucas throws at his head this episode, that might have been poetic justice. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This episode is a direct sequel to Lineage, where we discovered Lionel has an illegitimate son the mentally unhinged mother, Rachel Dunleavy, believed was Clark. Lionel lied there and claimed the boy was dead, but we know from the final image in that episode that he's still alive, and Lionel is keeping him a secret. Lex finds Lucas in what I can only assume is Edge City's version of Chinatown, and conveniently shows up just as Lucas is discovered to be cheating at a mob poker game, and thugs are trying to kill him. Good thing Lex is trying to use Lucas as a pawn in his scheme against his father, or Lucas would be sushi, and that's a pretty elaborate setup he's got there with his sidekick. Let's call that guy Kato. You can't help but wonder how they set up all those cameras in this secret club, or if they're somehow tapping into a security system that's already there. 2003 doesn't feel all that long ago to me, but somehow feeding Lucas the other player's hand by way of pager seems ancient. So now we've got, as the title suggests, a prodigal son scenario. If you're not familiar with the biblical parable, don't worry, you surely will be by the time you've seen this episode. As Lionel points out, contrary to the Cain and Abel story, Lex seems to have accepted his brother with open arms. But of course, Lex never does anything without a more dubious ulterior motive. It's an epic chess match filled with intrigue, innuendo, and econobabble, with a lot of business jargon about controlling interest and company shares and inheritance that sometimes feels like smart espionage writing, and sometimes sounds like Brannon Braga making up fancy tech speak to launch us to the next plot point of a Star Trek episode. Lex's gambit seems like a great move until we discover he was set up by Lionel, and Lex played right into his hands. And I really wish his plan had worked, just to see Lionel turn into Norman Osborn. Out, am I? Oh, and what a coincidence. Spider-Man came out just 9 months before this episode. This is one of those rare instances where I actually kind of buy a master manipulator in a long con, knowing what his victim will do when he dangles the worm on the hook, because it doesn't feel like a lot of random stuff happens and then the episode retroactively says the bad guy somehow had the foresight to orchestrate all of it. But don't worry, we've got 8 more seasons. There's plenty of time for that sort of thing. Lex hopes to use Lucas's enormous inheritance to gain control of the vital 10% he needs to vote Lionel out of his company and take over Luthor Corp. Though why you'd make it this easy for your kids to vote you out of your own company is beyond me. Lex is feeling pretty good about himself until Lionel suddenly drops a bomb on him. Since he owns LexCorp now and Lex put all his assets up as collateral against the loan when he started his company, everything Lex owns is actually Lionel, and he can kick him out on the street without a cent to his name anytime he wants. Surely Lex knew this and had to have known he was taking a giant gamble by defying Lionel in any way whatsoever. But he's not concerned since he has his future vampire ace in the hole in Lucas. Except that this is where the long con reveals itself. Lionel and Lucas have been in cahoots from the beginning, and Lionel secretly let Lex find him, knowing this would be his play, and sets him up for a fall. Lionel doesn't do anything the easy way. He loves these overly complicated Shakespearean dramas. He could have just kicked Lex out of the mansion in Suspect. It's hard to be sure what exactly his endgame is here, since it doesn't play out the way he expects, and whether the writers really know what Lionel wants from his son, or what even his larger goals are concerning Clark and the Kuwachi Caves, 2 connected things he has enormous interest in, and that he knows Lex is an integral part in uncovering all the secrets to. Surely Lionel isn't planning on cutting Lex off and disowning him forever. There's no way he'd underestimate him like that. He isn't trying to replace Lex with Lucas after all, even though he tries to manipulate Lucas into thinking that just to make him play along, since he refuses to take Lionel's initial $10 million bribe. I'm pretty sure this is all a ruse to intimidate Lex into submission, to prove to him that he doesn't have the resources, the wit, or the tenacity to take Lionel on. Lex comes up with a plan to even the playing field, but not before he finds himself on the Kent farm, working the fields. In a genuinely amusing and fun reversal I would have loved to have lived with longer, Lex comes to the Kents with nothing but the inordinately expensive clothes on his back and asks if he can stay with them for a while. He's the perfect house guest, trying to prove to Jonathan that he, quote, pulls his own weight. We see a glimpse of what Lex might be without the chip on his shoulder and his desperation to get away from the reputation of the Luthor name. And he impresses Jonathan for never complaining about all the crappy farm chores he's given. In a moving scene that's always stuck with me, Lex announces his departure and Jonathan says, "You're welcome back anytime," unable to find any ulterior motive for Lex's seemingly uncharacteristic behavior beyond wanting to show Jonathan that he can be a better man. After their confrontation just 4 episodes ago in Insurgents, when Jonathan discovered it was Lex's fault his wife was being held hostage at gunpoint, it's impressive I'm buying this scene, which is naturally instantly ruined by the standard Smallville knock somebody out just when I'm starting to feel something move, to set up yet another denouement involving a Luthor held at gunpoint and Clark happening on the scene just in the nick of time. You know, that's bound to happen when you call up the mafia on your brother who cheated in a backdoor poker game. Weird how similar this climax is to the one in Insurgents, and in the very same location. Perhaps that's on purpose. If this wasn't all an act, Lex might have gotten his own brand of poetic justice, where he shot by the father he sought to spy on and then accidentally got kidnapped in the same office where that happened. And come to think of it, it's also a little like the climax of Lineage. Lucas is pretending to force Lionel into a situation where he'd be able to blame him for killing Lex, and also has Lex tied to a chair. Like mother, like son, I guess. But of course, nothing is as it seems to Lionel, just as it wasn't to Lex before. Off-screen, Lex managed to convince Lucas to pretend to kidnap him and force Lionel into a situation where he would have to shoot one of his own children and show his true colors. Because up until now, Lucas is hoping he can trust his father, live as a true Luthor heir, and have a real family with his father. But he has his doubts, because A, Lionel didn't even tell him he was his father until a few weeks earlier, and he's known about Lucas his whole life. B, Lucas figured out Lionel's been faking his blindness for the last few weeks, so he's extremely chronically deceptive in general. And C, Lionel tried to buy Lucas off. I mean, really, when your father tells you you can trust that he'll keep his word and not throw you back out on the street like he did your brother on the grounds that you're his son when, you know, the other guy is also his son and the one he raised and conceived by the woman he was actually married to, you gotta be a tad suspicious. Lucas tries to force Lionel to shoot Lex and prove where his loyalties lie, but Clark heat visions Lucas's gun and makes him drop it. Lionel fires blanks at Lucas and discovers to his dismay that this time he's the one who got played. Clark's intervention inadvertently gave Lex exactly what he wanted, proof for Lucas that Lionel doesn't really care about him, because I guess the A, B, and C I just laid out wasn't enough for him. Oh, and Lex knows Lionel can see now, because Lionel tells Lucas to put down the ducky if he wants to play the saxophone. I mean, to put down the gun. And Lex is all like, wait a minute, how do you know he's got a gun? Usually I'd find this sort of thing too convenient. Lucas finds out Lionel can see, and so Lex has to figure it out the same episode, but I'm surprised to actually believe it in the moment, that with tensions running high and Lionel having to keep track of all his lies and moves and counter moves, he might have that sort of momentary lapse. His sadistic plans thwarted by the brothers he hoped to pit against each other, Lionel tells Lex he wants to patch things up between them and offers to give him LexCorp back in exchange for his silence about what happened with Lucas. And it's completely ambiguous as to whether Lex takes that deal or what exactly the situation is between them when the episode ends. Lex takes Lucas into his protection and we never see him again. So is Lex hiding him away on a lavish island somewhere, giving him whatever his heart desires? Or does he drop him to the bottom of the river with cement galoshes? You decide. And there's a pointless subplot that's really badly integrated with the A story about Clark trying to get a job at the Talon as a strategy to get closer to Lana. Spoiler alert, he works there a day and a half, shows up late, leaves in the middle of his shift to save Lex, and gets fired. Shocker. Lex thematically ties things up nicely at the end, comparing his father to Clark's, the one he wishes he had, and the one he wishes he could find a way to be more like. Then credits. This episode gets back to the heart of what the show is at its best, an ongoing argument about where good and bad come from and whether anyone really has a choice in who or what they become. And as I've said before, I really love the potential in the destiny versus free will debate in a prequel show about characters we more or less know are going to turn out a certain way. With Lucas, we're able to explore that question through new eyes. We've spent a lot of time here comparing Clark and Lex's opposite upbringings and how hard Lex has struggled to not become his father and to understand that other world of values placed before the acquisition of power and wealth. But Lucas brings a whole new perspective. That of, at least ostensibly, no upbringing at all. He's a fusion of Clark and Lex in the sense that he grew up unprivileged like Clark, but learned to think strategically and manipulate people around him to get what he wants, like Lex. He's also born into wealth like Lex, but abandoned like Clark, a man with potential for greatness who couldn't possibly know what incredible power would one day be showered upon him. Lucas believes strictly in nurture over nature, and thinks he has more control over his own life than most people because he's provided his own nurture. As he says to Clark on the farm, parents always try to make you little versions of themselves. And I like the way he puts this, that if Lex were raised by the Kents and Clark by the Luthors, Clark would be rich and miserable and Lex would be wearing flannel. He firmly believes he has more choice in forging his own identity because he raised himself, that the ticket to true independence is the lack of guidance. And so Clark and Lex are both trapped. They will simply become their fathers. But of course, it's more complicated than that, and the episode does a great job of driving that point home while the character it's suggesting this with is totally oblivious. Lucas fails to realize, or is maybe in denial about, how similar he is to his father regardless of not being raised by him. Either genetics, his environment, or a combination of both lead him to turn as conniving, underhanded, and opportunistic as his father and brother. Is that because he's a Luthor in his blood, or is it as much because of his environment as Lex's Luthorness is? Lionel tells Lex he can't trust Lucas at the end of the episode, that even though he convinced Lucas to join him against his father, Lucas will at some point betray Lex again. And I think he's perhaps implying also that neither of them can change. Lionel invokes the popular Frog and the Scorpion parable, the same story that was used 6 years earlier to describe the Borg in a Star Trek Voyager two-parter that derived its title from that story called Scorpion. I wonder if that parable showing up here and Lionel's version being much more condensed from Chakotay's has anything to do with the fact that Kenneth Biller produced Voyager and the show, at least from 2002 to 2004, even though he doesn't have a writing credit on this episode. In the story, a scorpion asks a frog's help in crossing a stream and promises not to sting him, but even though the frog helps him and trusts him, the scorpion stings him anyway because it's his nature. Lionel suggests Lucas can't help but be what he is, and that even if he wanted to, he couldn't change his stripes, or his claws. Kind of a mixed metaphor. Of course, Lucas is shaped as much by his lack of guidance as Clark and Lex are shaped by their fathers, and arguably, he's shaped as much by Lionel as Lex is. Lionel intentionally sent him off to jump from foster home to foster home, secretly bailing him out when he was in a jam but never being there, never even allowing Lucas to know he has a father. I think Lex is right when he says it's a twisted social experiment. Give one son everything and one son nothing and see what happens when they finally meet. Lucas is still raised by Lionel, he just doesn't know it, and that upbringing leads him to distrust people and use them more than Lex. In short, Lucas has no sense of morality, perhaps is even totally lacking in empathy because he avoids role models. In trying to get out from under his father's shadow, there are a number of examples already of role models Lex has found that he tries to emulate over his father, namely Clark's parents and the farmers on the ranch his mother brought him to as a child, that have influenced him and helped him to develop a moral center. But that ultimately keeps failing Lex because he continues to feel the need to use his father's tactics in order to emancipate himself. And now Lex has the opportunity to take what he's learned from the Kents and be the role model Lucas never had. I can't help but think that Lucas could be Lex's ticket down a better path. The person he feels the need to lead by example for, because he hates himself for using his brother like Lionel has always used him, and because he hates that Lionel has turned Lucas into the son he always wanted precisely by not being there. And after all, how many of us have gained a great deal of our sense of responsibility because we're older siblings? I can't hold it against this episode, but it's a huge misstep that nothing is ever done with that. And so I'm inclined to believe that what Lionel is calling nature is really calculated environmental influence on his part. Lucas thinks he has all the choice in the world to be whatever he wants, but all he's ever known is survival and getting all he can. So he became a creature of instinct, again, because of the situation Lionel has perpetually kept him locked into. Clark and Lex are both given myriad opportunities to become the opposite of what they are, and ultimately each of them become their fathers not only because of how they were raised, but because they choose not to turn away from it. Well, until the end of the series, when that completely falls apart with Lex. But we'll get there. One day. The optimism of the episode is that Lucas gets away from the street life and from his father and might finally have that opportunity to really choose for himself. And also that Lucas isn't so far gone that he doesn't still want the same things Lex is longing for, even though he won't admit it. Lucas pretends he's only out for himself and his rightful inheritance, but I think, just like Lex, a real home and a real family matters more to him than that $50 million. This is perhaps the most likable we ever see Lex in the series, and appropriate then also the happiest. I love Lex's feeling of accomplishment and pride, both in the work he does with his own two hands and not because of anything handed to him apart from a few tools, and in finally convincing Jonathan there's more to him than the Luthor name. Lex continues to be really sympathetic, even when he does the really duplicitous thing because of moments like this, where he clearly, genuinely wants to be a better person. Lex has one of his best lines in the entire series at the end of this episode when he says, "My father may try to rule the world, but yours will inherit the earth." That's exactly Lex Luthor versus Superman. One tries to control everything, and the other has the love and admiration of the whole world precisely because he isn't trying to do that. We've been comparing Clark and Lex's upbringing ad nauseum since the beginning of this series, but this episode is one of my favorite examples of the contrast. Jonathan wants his son to grow up and be a better man than he ever was. Lionel is threatened by his sons and is mortified by the prospect of one of them outshining him, because he had children to use and manipulate just as he does with everything. Lionel throws Lex out of the mansion as a move in his sadistic game. Jonathan invites Lex into his home because, despite his personal feelings, it's the right thing to do. Lionel tries to make amends with Lex in the end, not because he cares about his son or feels any remorse for putting him in another situation that could have gotten him killed, again, but because he lost, and he's trying to salvage what he can until the next opportunity arises to strike. Jonathan tells Lex he's welcome back any time because he's earned at least a little of Jonathan's trust. I love how much Lex truly seems to appreciate what Jonathan is all about and how much his values and lifestyle agree with Lex, and the comparison makes his relationship with his father all the more disturbing. This episode isn't exactly forthcoming about what the status quo is between Lex and Lionel at the end, and it's not because it's trying to keep us guessing. That scene in Lex's office plays like things have arrived at a specific concrete place, and I have no idea what it is. Does Lex agree to take LexCorp back from his father? I don't know, he never actually commits. And if telling the world about what happened with Lucas would really be that damaging to Lionel, why wouldn't Lex just do that? I mean, Lionel controls his assets and maybe he doesn't want to go down with the ship, but at this point, Lex has nothing at all, and therefore nothing to lose. Now you might say, well, Cap, you just got through talking about how sympathetic and likable Lex is, and now you want him to turn his dad in for petty revenge. But remember that Lionel didn't hesitate to pull the trigger on his own son, not to mention all the other sociopathic activities he's been doing. Lex would be doing the world a big favor if he could prove anything. But the other problem with this scene is just that. Lex doesn't have any proof of anything. Apparently the only reason Lionel offers to give Lex anything at the end is so he won't talk about Lucas. But we know Chloe is already aware of Lucas's arrival almost at the beginning of the episode. I'm not exactly sure how she knows about that, but whatever. So Lucas's existence isn't a secret, especially because Lionel magicked a Metropolis United Charities file on him out of thin air, so all his ducks would be in a row if anyone looked into Lucas's history. Because, only 2 cases at an adoption agency doesn't look suspicious at all. So the only thing they could possibly be talking about is Lionel shooting blanks, I guess. Well, that proved to Lucas that Lionel was as scummy and as disinterested in having a real relationship with him as Lex said, but it doesn't give them anything on Lionel Lex could use against him, say, in court. What does Lionel need Lex to keep quiet about? You could really write Clark out of his own show this episode, and it's the same episode. There's a pseudo-rivalry between Lucas and Clark that could have been interesting, but it fizzles out before anything's done with it. This was clearly meant to be Clark's in for this episode, but it doesn't work at all. Clark is the brother Lex never had that Lucas could have been, and Lucas seems maybe threatened by that, but because he's actually planning on double-crossing Lex and isn't even trying to form a real relationship with him until maybe at the end, that doesn't play, and it strikes me as a cheap ploy to make the audience trust Lucas there. There's no reason for Lucas to pretend Clark's in his way, really, so I'm not sure where his animosity is coming from. If Lucas's motivations were different and he really did want not a good relationship with Lex, that would make sense. And it might have been interesting for Lucas to find out that only a few months earlier, his birth mother thought Clark was him. He also gets really curious about Clark's abilities. First, when he hits his hand on Clark while they're playing basketball and says it feels like Clark has a steel plate. And then when Clark saves him in the alleyway outside of the Talon, stopping bullets in bullet time, wondering how anyone could react that fast. This seems like evidence that Lucas is turning out a lot like Lex despite not being raised by Lionel, and I guess that's really all it is because nothing else is done with that. I also wish we got Clark's side of the nature-nurture argument he has with Lucas. When Lucas says he thinks people are just little versions of their parents, Clark says, "That's an interesting theory, I don't think I buy it though." Okay. What do you think, Clark? That is a very Superman outlook if he's saying that people inherently know right and wrong and can choose for themselves, so you don't have to be your parents if you don't want to, and there are plenty of good examples to look up to if you don't get the necessary lessons from your parents. But with that elaboration, and based on what we've seen from this Clark so far, it's hard not to assume that's coming from Clark's fate over free will attitude. Clark is always trying to figure out what he's supposed to do, like what the universe wants him to do, compared to Lex, who wants to believe he has the power to choose. So Clark really might mean that it doesn't matter how you're raised, it's just your destiny to be however you turn out. Lana doesn't know about Red K, has no idea why Clark was making out with Chloe last episode. He gives her zero explanation, brings pizza and a rose, and now he thinks the best strategy in winning her over again is applying for a job. Clark's always letting her down because he's got to run off and save people, or because some alien something rather gets in his system and makes him act like a jerk boyfriend. So he decides the best way to patch things up with her is to put himself in a situation where that's likely to happen more often. I'm assuming he doesn't really care about the money. I mean, he's never talked about getting a job to my recollection before, and this isn't a person who has hobbies or interests, and I mean, why start now? And as we saw last episode, the Kents are magically in the clear and have no money woes beyond funding their son's college education now. After what Clark did to her last episode and how dramatically she reacted to it, I can't believe she's even entertaining this. And Chloe should see right through Clark's motivations and be annoyed with him for continuing to pursue Lana. I mean, to be consistent, not because I like that she's jealous and guilt-trippy. But instead, she encourages Lana to hire him, like it's unfair if she doesn't because he's her friend and he could do the job. And honestly, the writing is so inconsistent with the relationship stuff episode to episode right now that I can't decide if either of them are acting out of character or if they were more out of character last episode and now they're back to normal. This just strikes me as a really contrived way to get Lana in the episode and to involve Clark in the main drama. Lucas goes to the Talon and tries to make Lana fire Clark just to get back at Lex for interfering in his plans, and that's just silly. Clark has no character arc here beyond big profound moment of clarity, learning he's not reliable enough to hold down a steady job. And honestly, he doesn't need to be any more involved with Lex's drama beyond his being a sounding board for Lex and LaFarm. The Climax doesn't even need him, except to fill the save the day quota. That situation might have been more interesting if we saw it play out without Clark's interference, but then that might have seemed convenient. The one time Clark doesn't show up just in the nick of time, and Lionel's firing blanks. And now it's time for things to ask Jarell when I get to heaven. If Lionel has always known about Lucas, but Lucas just found out about Lionel a few weeks back, what's with the picture in the locket at the end of Lineage? That clearly shows a younger Lionel sitting with a little boy and suggested that he had a secret relationship with the boy, not that he never told Lucas about himself. This show really needed more forethought if it wanted to be a continuing drama over an episodic show. I suppose he might have met Lucas just because he was curious to see what he was like and Lucas didn't know he was his dad, was maybe young enough he doesn't even remember that now, but I doubt seriously if the scenario we're given here was always the plan. You don't have to have everything figured out when you set up a development like this, but when you build on it, it should match what you introduced. It's like improv comedy. Whatever you've established counts, and you can't go back on it whether you're happy with what you did in the first place or not. How long has Lionel been faking his blindness? He says a few weeks, which, if we can even believe it hasn't been longer than that, could go back pretty far. I mean, did he see Clark use his powers in his office in Insurgents? Did he see Clark use his powers even before that, and has several of them on record in the file he had on Clark in his vault? What about the thing with the helicopter in Nocturne? Did he see who shot him in Suspect? This one's not a criticism so much as a curiosity, though I doubt if the producers could answer that question, or if John Glover knew his character was already sighted until this episode. Oh, and that seems a little unlikely, right? That he's totally blind, the doctors don't think he'll ever see again, and then suddenly he's got his vision back. I mean, I'm not saying that's never happened in the history of the world, but that kind of thing generally only happens on TV, right? And now let's go on to the count. We've got one fake death, that's Lucas Luthor, and of course, he didn't fake his death on purpose, but Lionel did it to him. We've got one instance of bullet time, that's Clark stopping bullets from the Edge City Hitman. We've got two love triangles this episode. They're not romantic love triangles, but family love triangles. One with Lionel, Lex, and Lucas, and one with Lex, Lucas, and Clark. Kind of. That's never really built on, but it's there. I'm going to give Prodigal a 3 out of 4. This is Smallville family drama at its finest, minus a confusing ending and a superfluous Clark. Was there anything I missed in any category? Leave me a personal message on Geekvolution, and I'll be sure to add it to the count. I'm Captain Logan, and consider this episode counted.
You gotta put down the ducky. Put down the ducky. Put down the ducky if you wanna play the saxophone.